Hey, good morning everyone. Welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be making some sourdough. In a previous video you saw how I started a new sourdough start from the very beginning. So today I'm going to be making a loaf of bread. And for those of you who don't know, sourdough is a long process. It generally takes a couple of days to get a sourdough loaf. And that's because it's a slower active type of yeast that takes a couple of days for you to get that volume and what they call that crumb, those little bubbles inside your bread, to happen. So you got to start out with your freshly fed sourdough when it's at its peak, just starting to kind of fall. And then you start making your dough. And then there's a whole process to that, and we're going to go over that in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, good morning. It is day 2 after I fed the starter last night, and as you can see, nice and bubbly. It's risen more than double the size, and it's just about to start falling in on itself. So we've pretty much peaked, what they call peaked for the sourdough at this point, and it's ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and get everything together, and I'm going to start the process of making a sourdough loaf. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my salt in this little bowl here, and I'm going to dilute it with a little bit of hot water just to kind of help it break down before I put it in the dough, so it just distributes a little bit easier. So I need 8 grams of salt. This is kosher salt. You can use sea salt, you can use Himalayan salt. Salt is very important. You don't want to eliminate salt from your sourdough bread because it helps, it assists that rise effort from the yeast. So you don't want to eliminate it. You will see a much denser type of sourdough. All right, so we're going to get started. I already have the 8 grams of salt in here. I'm going to put, actually I'm going to use the hot tea kettle water because I'm only putting a little bit in here. Just to dissolve it, that's all I want to do. Get my scale back on. I'm talking too much and the scale doesn't want to wait for me to finish talking. I need 100 grams of my starter, and I'm going to use pretty much almost all of this in here. There will be some left over. So I am at almost at 100. I'm just going to break that off. That's it. So I have barely anything left in there. And that's what I like about this technique, you know, is that you don't need a lot of starter to make a loaf of bread. As long as you have less starter than you're feeding it, you're always going to have an active starter. As long as you're starting out with an active starter, okay? And what I'm going to do is this is going to get popped into the refrigerator because I don't make bread every day. I make bread every other day. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this in the refrigerator. And if anyone's wondering what this is how much this jar weighs. So when I put this on the scale tomorrow, when I start making another loaf of bread for the next day, I know how much this jar is supposed to weigh because I want between 25 and 50 grams of I want 25 of 50 grams starter left in this jar. Okay, does that make sense? So what I would do is whatever this weighs, I subtract this, and that lets me know how much starter is in here. And there's probably about 50 grams in there right now. So I may have to remove some. It really depends. So, but that's what that number means. And I have a kitty who's going to help me. You want to say hello to everybody? This is Mr. Finley. Huh. We call him Finn, Finnegan, Finley. Isn't he beautiful? You're not looking at the camera. You don't want to see your fans? Oh well. So I'm going to zero my scale here. And now I'm going to put the water in. And so I'm looking at my cheat sheet up here. I need 260 grams of water. I'm going to put a little less because I have this water here. That is plenty. Now he's back and he's attacking my feet. All right, so now I'm just going to add the salt, and I have about 10 mLs of water in here, so I only got this to about 250 in water. So I'm just going to whisk this together. And I love these dough whisks. I really like this because when you get to the mixing of the flour in here, you'll see what happens. Because there isn't a whole lot of surface area for things to stick to, the dough just kind of falls off this. I'm just going to give this a good mix. You're still going to have little bits and pieces in there, but that's all right. Just trying to dissolve it. And then the last thing I'm going to add is my flour. Now I'm using all-purpose unbleached bread flour. You can use all-purpose unbleached flour if you want to, but it really needs to be unbleached because you want the natural yeast that has accumulated on your wheat berries to be part of your fermenting process, because that's going to feed the yeast. You want to, the sugars are going to dissolve and you're going to feed your yeast. So it's important that it's unbleached. So now I'm going to add the flour, and I need 390 grams of flour. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and get this mixed up. Your dough is going to be shaggy at this point. Your main purpose at this stage, combining everything together, is to just get as much of the flour incorporated. You don't want to have any bits and pieces of flour not mixed into your dough. It comes together pretty easily. You can see that there's some dough on this bread spoon. I'm just going to call it a bread spoon just to be done with it. But you can see it's actually falling off as I'm just standing here with it. So it really releases much easily because of the smaller surface area. But it does a great job in mixing everything. So I've gotten this all mixed together. And we're all set, and I'm going to let this sit for half an hour before I even touch it. And that's a process called auto-leasing. It's just basically a fancy word for allowing the flour to become hydrated with the water that you put in there. So I'm not going to do anything with this for half an hour. I'm going to let this sit. And you'll see that there'll be a little slight difference in the texture. I'll show you what it looks like when I try to do a stretch and fold. When we get to that point, it'll look a little bit different than what you're going to see right now. So let me show you a little bit up close here. So right now, if I try to do a stretch and fold, it's really just it's going to fall apart. It's going to rip and tear. Okay. And that's normal because the flour isn't hydrated. So as you can see, if I try to stretch and fold, it's really just tearing on me right now. Okay. So we're going to let this sit for half an hour and we'll be back. All right, so it's been sitting for at least a half an hour. It's been almost an hour, actually. And you can see the consistency is different. It really does look more hydrated. So we're going to do our first stretch and fold. I'm going to give you a little tip. You want to wet your hand. It'll help keep the dough from sticking to you. And so I'm just going to kind of scoop up around it, get it loose from the bowl. And I'm going to pull it. And you can already see I'm pulling and we're not tearing, so that's a great sign. And then you're just going to flop it over. I'm going to wet my hand again. Rotate your bowl. Stretch. Fold it over. Rotate the bowl. Stretch. Just kind of let it dangle there. Fold it over. One more stretch. I usually do 4. And just fold that over. All right, so there we go. So when you're doing these stretches and folds, you're just kind of trying to develop the gluten. And you're also adding a little bit of air because you're folding it on top of itself. So we're going to let this sit, and I'm going to come back in about a half an hour and I'm going to do another stretch and fold. All right, this is the second fold. It's been about a half an hour. You can actually see that the texture is even more, looks even more smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and do a stretch and fold for this one. And depending on what I see and how I feel that this dough is coming along, I might do one more stretch and fold before I do a bulk ferment. And I think I'm at the point where I'm just going to let this bulk ferment after this stretch and fold. And basically, I'm just going to let this sit in the bowl in a warm spot for the next several hours because it's really creating a lot of elastic, and you can almost see I can get a nice window pane right here. So this has definitely created enough elasticity. Now I just want to get it to rise. So with that, I'm just going to turn it. Plug upside down. Just give it a little bit of a turn in the bowl. Create a little tension. And you can see I got a couple of air bubbles already starting to form, and it's only been less than 2 hours that I started this. So I'm going to cover it, and I'm going to let this bulk ferment here on the counter. I have my oven on because I'm going to be making some dinner, so the room's going to get a little bit warmer, and I'm going to let this bulk ferment. I'm going to get ready to do the final shape, and I'm going to put this in my batten. If you don't have a batten, you can use a bowl with a cloth lined and floured. You want to make sure that you flour it really well so that it doesn't stick, because there's some moisture in here and it can, wick into the fabric and stick there. So you want to just make sure that you're flouring this really well. As you can see, this has really blossomed really well. It's risen twice the size that it was. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this out. I am going to put a little bit of flour on the surface, very, very little bit. Just a little bit, not too much. All right, and I'm going to turn this out. And if you don't have a scraper, I suggest getting one. It just makes things easier to get out of your bowl. Keeps your hands clean. You worked really hard to get all that air in there. You want to try not to deflate it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull these corners in to the middle, like so. This has a lot of great air bubbles, so this should be a nice light loaf, we hope. Okay, and take my spatula, and I'm going to turn this over. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a tucking and a twisting motion just to get a nice taut ball. So I'm pushing this under and twisting at the same time, and it's just creating a tautness over the top of the bowl. Boule. That's what they call this, a boule shape. There's lots and lots of little air bubbles on the top here, so that's great. That's a great sign. And I'm doing this till I get a nice taut top, and I'm also trying to seal the bottom. Okay. So now that's ready to go in my basket. And what I'm going to do is just going to lift this up and flip it in here. And again, just try not to deflate it if you can. And I got it in there a little bit crooked, so I'm going to shift it. All right. So as you can see, this is a little bit open here. There are a couple of different techniques that you can do to kind of close up the bottom. I'm just going to pinch the ends together like this. That's all. There's like a stitching process. I'm not that fancy. Okay, so this is going to sit on the counter for another hour, and then I'm going to cover it and I'm going to put it in the refrigerator where it's going to do its final fermentation overnight. And then in the morning we'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like, and I'll show you the process when we bake it. Okay, you can see that the dough has risen quite a bit sitting in the refrigerator overnight, so this is going to be a nice active sourdough. I have a piece of parchment paper. I use my parchment paper at least twice. Sometimes I can get 3 uses out of it just to be a little bit more, money friendly, I guess. So I'm going to flip this out onto this parchment paper. Should come out because I did flour the bowl. Nice. All right. And then I'm going to score the bread. And you're scoring the bread because you want to give it an area for the steam to evacuate. You don't, if you don't do this, basically what's going to happen is you're going to wind up getting a blowout. Somewhere around the crust of the bread, it's going to break. And it may not look as attractive. So I'm just going to make a score. The first score you do for the release of the steam should be pretty deep, at least a 1/2 inch down, and you want to come all the way to the ends. And sometimes I'll go back over just to make sure it released. Sometimes it likes to re-stick to itself. Now I am going to just put a couple little extra little scores. This is just more or less for decoration. I have my cast iron, I think it's an 6 or 8 quart cast iron pot that's been in the oven for at least half an hour. It's at 450. I'm going to take that out and I'm going to put this bread in that pot. And you're going to put the lid on. And I cook it for about a half an hour with the lid on, and then I take the lid off and cook it for another 10 minutes. And the lid, having the lid on is just helping to trap the steam in there so you get that nice rise of the bread. All right, so this will be in there for 30 minutes with the lid on, 10 minutes with the lid off, and then 40 minutes total. And then we'll come back and we'll see what the bread looks like when it's ready to come out of the oven. Okay, so there you go. We got ourselves a nice fresh loaf of sourdough. I'm going to let this cool completely, and then we're going to cut into it. We have some family coming over. We're going to have some dinner, and we're going to really enjoy this. I hope this video was helpful. I hope there were some tips in there you may not have known about. I will leave in the description below the link to a couple of sourdough, what I would call professionals on YouTube that really helped me out and may be able to help you out as well. So thanks for watching, guys.